Welcome to the Deer Wizard Podcast, conversation shaping the deer industry. I'm your host, Josh Newton, the Deer Wizard. Through interviews, advocacy, and industry news, we deliver field-proven insights to help producers build better herds. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Deer Wizard Podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you. We appreciate you. Just as an update, we did get everything posted up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you want to listen to your audio feeds. So that's good to go. I'll start sharing that out. Those links are in the show notes. So hopefully those of you riding around, doing chores, heading to the store, heading to a trade show, whatever, you can pop us on the podcast. So that's all good to go. You can also find all the podcasts listed over at fusionanimalhealth.com. So we got an interesting show today. I've been kind of following along, I suspect as many of you have, with what's going on in Minnesota. And I just had an article pop up across my feed from RFD TV. And there's an interview that Roger McEwen, I hope I'm not butchering your name, Roger, but he wrote Firm to Farm, a property rights battle in Minnesota over deer farming and CWD. And that's really the kicker here is CWD is being used as a club or a cudgel to, regulate a livestock farming business. So just a quick one-liner on the author, Kansas Farm Bureau, professor of agricultural law and taxation with Washburn University School of Law. So the guy's got some credentials. I'm going to try to spare you reading all this, and I'll have my normal interjections. If you've listened to any of my previous shows, I'll try to preface that saying, this is my opinion. So, for the past, couple years, this has been going on, and I'm gonna reach out to the folks in Minnesota and see if they want to come on and chat about this a little bit. I know that this has been a long process that they've been going through, and they're fighting for their existence. So what does this all stem from? This all stems from them being a livestock industry, right? So they're an ag industry. They raise deer, okay? There's a disease called chronic wasting disease, and it's a neurological disease that affects deer, elk, moose, all members of the deer family. And so there's an extensive program that's been built around this. And USDA kind of has the standard for what the federal program looks like, and then the states have, their ability to have their own state programs to go above and beyond that for in-state commerce. If you want to do out-of-state commerce, let's just say from a state like mine in Pennsylvania to a state like Ohio or New York or whatever, there's different rules for those things, and many states have just closed their borders altogether and said, hey, we're not willing to do this. Now, the debate really comes into question when you look at the fence, right? So you have these animals that are part of this program, extensive program, heavily regulated, lots of paperwork, lots of testing. And we're going to not get into the details of that today. There's tons of resources out there on what these programs look like. And then you have animals on the other side of the fence that are typically managed by a Department of Natural Resource or DNR, a game commission like in our state, or generally speaking, we'll just call them wildlife agencies, right? And there's this tool that is CWD that's being used to basically regulate these agriculture practices out of existence, right?
And so it started to raise a much bigger question about legality, a person's fundamental rights to pursue an occupation, to farm. And if I look at a state, again, I'm not a Minnesota resident, never raised deer in Minnesota, but I've raised deer long enough here in Pennsylvania. Minnesota, outside of a couple cities, has a lot of rural ground. It's a it's a big ag state, right? They got a lot of, you know, rural economic impact. And so people have, decided that they want to raise deer and preserve these animals. And there's various ways in which they do that, right? And so along comes CWD, and there's, regardless of, quote unquote, which side of the fence you sit on, there's hysteria about what CWD is, how it impacts deer herds, how it impacts deer. There's so much unknown about CWD, and there's been tens of millions of dollars spent on it over the past couple decades to study it, what it is, how it affects animals, etc. And the again, I don't know the specifics of the whole timeline of what's happened in Minnesota, but I will say that, to my best understanding, this was a legal entity. These farms are a legal entity that are regulated under the Department of Agriculture, and the legislator said, "Nope, we're just going to unilaterally shift some of this burden over to the DNR, and the DNR is not favorable towards these individuals." And they said basically, "Hey, there's these, you know, um, there's these new regulations which we're putting in play, and when you look at those, they're called the statutory provisions." So I'll just read a little excerpt from the article here. Um, the Senate File 553 passed in 2025 during the legislative session. The bill codifies the most stringent fencing requirements in the nation, effectively moving the state to a no contact state between wild and farm deer. Under Minnesota statute 35.155, all registered farms must utilize exclusionary fencing. The primary configurations for farmers are both physically and financially daunting. So there's 4 different options here. Option 1, double fencing, 2 separate 8-foot fences spaced by at least 4 feet. Option 2, secondary mesh barrier. Secondary mesh fencing, holes no larger than 2 by 4 inches, attached to the primary fence with 12-inch spacers. Option 3, solid material, attaching wood, tin, or dense shade cloth to the fence, reaching a minimum height of 5 feet. Option 4, electrified barrier, a multi-strain 5,000 volt fence with battery backup and alarm system. So again, as someone who has raised deer for a long, long time, many of these, well, all of these have different financial impacts to the farm that is being mandated to put these up. And we can look at them and say, okay, again, this is my opinion. Somebody sitting at a desk who's never been out in the field and hasn't had to maintain fence doesn't understand how this construction works. So all these farms have 8-foot fencing. This is fence made to keep deer in and keep the outside animals out. They've done everything that they've had to do. And on a whim, they've been stuck with these 4 different options. So many farmers have their fence lines basically up to the boundary lines. So they'd have to create some sort of internal fence. Maybe if they put this up, the external fence wouldn't meet the code requirements. for double fencing, mesh barriers, solid fencing. Like, have you heard of wind? It'll take it down, and that jeopardizes the structure of the fence that's there. So these options are less than ideal in all cases, right? And they're incredibly expensive. So some farms can have price tags reaching up to $200,000 to comply with this. Now, there may be one or two people that could do that, but for a small family farm, much of your assets are, in your equipment, in your land, in your animals, etc. And a $200,000 bill is just not viable, right? So you have this idea that, regulation can slowly choke out an industry, all around the guise of CWD. So there's some additional administrative issues that the author goes into. And there was a law also introduced called the Notice of Violation, and he listed as an administrative hammer used to ensure compliance. If a deficiency is found, farmers have a strict 14-day repair window. If a defect allows for the possibility of entry or escape, it must be fixed immediately. And so I suspect that if one of these four options isn't implemented, this notice of violation goes on. And so many of you know Steve Porter from Steve Porter's Trophy Whitetails. He's been doing the rounds on social, and we're gonna reach out to Steve and see if we can get him on, and he can work us through this whole process. And so he's really become a central figure in the opposition to this statutory scheme. It states that Porter received a notice of violation in July 2025 for failing to install the mandated double fence. Porter claimed that because his deer are legally defined as livestock, the DNR's wildlife-based rules contradict the Minnesota Constitution's protections for farmers. However, his refusal to comply due to the cost of the compliance and the state's position on phasing out the industry triggered the registration revocation process, aka the death penalty for a deer farm. So they go through, some of the process of the notice of violation. I thought some of these stats that the author put in place were interesting. So the industry economics. So registered whitetail deer farms have declined from 200 farms in 2020 to just 79 as of December 2025. And that's, listen to this. The state has banned all new registrations. So no new farms, right? Okay, fine. No new farms. So you have to exist within the current infrastructure. And they limit transfers to one-time handoff to immediate family members. So if you want to sell your farm, you can't sell it to somebody new. You can do a one-time handoff to immediate family members. I'm assuming those are, sons or daughters, or maybe your parents, but you're going the wrong way there. So there's a generational die-off that's been regulated into existence. So there's currently, as it stands, there's no future for these farms. So I know that the Minnesota Deer Farmers has filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court. I am the president of the Pennsylvania Deer Farmers Association. I know our association has signed on to the amicus brief, and we're going to see what that looks like. So if the Supreme Court decides to hear it, that'll be really interesting to see how those oral arguments come forth. So there is, and it's interesting, the author talks about the legal limit of regulatory phase-outs. So the Stroman case, and I'm reading from the article here, the Stroman case is an example of the tension between state police power and the right to pursue an occupation. When a legislature regulates a business to the point where it can no longer survive, it is walking a fine line between two major legal doctrines: the police power and fundamental rights. Minnesota's primary argument, which was upheld by the Eighth Circuit Court, is that the states have an inherent police power to protect public health, safety, and welfare. In particular, the state's position is that it's protecting the wild deer population from CWD is a legitimate government interest, and that banning new registrants and mandating expensive double fencing is a reasonable exercise of that power. Because the court ruled that deer farming is not a fundamental right like free speech or religion, the law only needs to pass the rational basis test. This is the lowest level of judicial review. The state just needs to show that the law is rationally related to a legitimate state interest. Under the Fifth Amendment, the government cannot take private property for public use without just compensation. A physical taking is not necessary. Regulatory takings are excuse my reading skills. Compensable if all economically viable use of the property in issue has effectively taken via regulation. Courts use the complex three-part test from Penn Central Transport Company versus New York to decide if a regulation is actually a taking. They look at the economic impact on the owner, the extent to which the regulation interferes with investment-backed expectations, and the character of the government action, e.g., whether it is a physical invasion or simply a general program. So this has much larger impacts than, quote unquote, putting deer farmers out of business. This is challenging some long-standing legal precedents, but it also has other animal livestock industries on alert. So let's look at cattle, dairy or beef, right? Let's look at bison. Let's look at the bovine species because those are the big ones. Let's say that it's not CWD that they're looking at. Let's say that it is brucellosis. This is a common disease that happens in bovine species. And, the author notes that it has this broader impact. So he writes, for broader agriculture, pork, poultry, beef, the case is a warning sign. It suggests that if a state agency like the Department of Health or Environmental Quality declares that a certain farming practice is a public health threat, the courts may not look very deeply into whether the science is settled before allowing the state to shut down the industry. Agriculture has historically been seen as a foundational right in America. Amen to that. That was my ad. This case shifts into the category of privileged activity that exists only at the pleasure of the state legislator. The regulatory phase out, this is a quote, the regulatory phase out of deer farming in Minnesota challenged the Jeffersonian ideal of virtuous cultivator by imposing costs that dictate when to sow and when to reap. The state moves away from Jefferson's warning that central direction leads to the collapse of an industry, shifting the farmer from independent producer to a regulated tenant of state policy. Could you imagine if in Minnesota they said, yeah, nope, can't raise cattle anymore? Or let's just say EPA says to the logging industry, which I know is large in Minnesota, can't cut down any more trees. Paper's illegal. And of course, you're saying, Josh, like, they're never going to do that. Really? You put it past the state of Minnesota? So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I'm going to link this article into the show notes. You can read the whole thing. But this is something of interest to not only the private deer industry, but all agriculture industries. If you have chickens, if you have turkeys, any type of poultry, you got cows, you have any type of livestock, don't put it past the government to potentially regulate you out of business, as they are using the CWD mantle in Minnesota. So there's also, I was digging around on the RFD TV site. So they did an interview with the author Roger McEwen. I have not watched that interview, but I will link it here. I'm going to watch it here after the show and check that out. But very, very interesting. And like I said, we're going to reach out to Steve and maybe Scott Fear. He's the president over at the Minnesota Deer Farmers Association. See if we can get them on the show for an interview. They can give us the specifics of the backstory. But keep an eye out for this. This is important to, not only deer farmers, but hunters, across the country. They can do it in one state. Somebody will pick up that mantle and try to do it in another. So let's keep our eyes and ears open for more on this. We'll see when Supreme Court, see if they take this up or not. And, we'll be rooting for the guys over in Minnesota. And hopefully, like I said, we can get Steve and possibly Scott on the show, get some background here and, get their take on what's going on from the inside, because I know they're doing a ton of work on this. So with that, stay tuned for another episode of the Deer Wizard podcast.